Ever wondered about different types of beverages in the Bible? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be discussing on this 170th episode of
The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing l'chaim to life.
L'chaim.
Well, welcome everybody to the next episode of The Jewish Drinking Show. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest Professor John Anthony Dunne to the show. Welcome, Professor Dunne.
Thank you so much for having me.
My absolute pleasure. For those less familiar with Professor Dunne, he completed a PhD in New Testament at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he studied under Professor N.T. Wright. Presently, he serves as Associate Professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is the co-host and editor of the Two Cities podcast and is the author of a handful of journal articles dedicated to wine in the Bible, with a forthcoming book addressing the full range of alcoholic beverages in biblical literature to be published by Zondervan Academic called Mountains Shall Drip Sweet Wine, a Biblical Theology of Alcohol. He also hosts an annual craft beer reception at the Society of Biblical Literature and American Academy of Religion conferences called the Society for Beer Lovers and Assorted Academic Research, which is fantastic already. And if he wasn't a Bible professor, he'd be a bartender at a craft cocktail bar. You've got this forthcoming book. So when should viewers, listeners who want to check out this more broadly about biblical stuff, when is that coming out?
Perhaps in the summer of 2025, maybe even the fall of 2025.
The topic we're going to talk today about is different types of wine or other alcoholic beverages in the Bible. So obviously there's wine, which is yayin in Hebrew, and that appears many times throughout.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the Bible, obviously your research covers both for the Christians here, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and for Jews, it covers both. But at least for our purposes today in this conversation, we're just talking about Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
So yayin appears still a lot of times, and it's really, is it fair to describe it as really the beverage par excellence of the Bible?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's the not only the term for alcoholic beverages that is mentioned the most, but the other sort of terms, probably all refer to grape-based alcohol anyways. The only exception potentially would be if we have references to beer. And this is hotly debated, whether like shekhar, for example, refers to beer, something that is possibly grain-based. There are maybe one or two other terms, but
I think that's a good tease, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's mostly for grape-based beverages, wine.
Mm-hmm.
So can you, even though I think wine, yayin is like super obvious and probably needs no introduction. I don't think any of the listeners here have never heard of this beverage called wine. And or don't even like to say that wine is in the Bible should shock nobody. Right. So even though it's like super maddeningly obvious, but what can you share about wine in the Bible?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one of the things to sort of think about when we're coming at this is our ways of classifying wine, our ways of thinking about wine is just so very different from what we see in biblical literature and in the ancient world more broadly. So we tend to think, for example, of wines by like, is it a red? Is it a white? Is it rosé? Is it sparkling? Is it a dessert wine? We don't get those kinds of classifications. It does seem predominantly like the kind of wine that is referenced is red wine. That does seem to be the case. The only exception I would point to is a New Testament example, so we can skip that for today. But other than that, all the references, either there's the overt Proverbs passage that talks about it being red, right? But then there's a lot of references to it being dark, or some kind of reference to like blood of the grapes, which implies red, right? So we know that a lot of the wines, if not, the vast majority, was red, but the kinds of provenantial kind of terms for wine, we don't see those either. There's just the only kind of references to where the wine comes from would be like a reference to Lebanon, or a reference to Helbin, or a potential reference to the choice vine, which the sorek could refer to a vine that maybe originally came from the city of Sorek, or could maybe be a way of saying that it's as good as wine that comes
Mhm.
from that place. Not entirely sure, but that's about as much as we really get.
That's the end of Genesis, right?
Yeah, in Genesis
Uh,
49, for
yeah.
example. Yeah.
So wine is the most appearing term for really any alcoholic beverage, and definitely wine. It's wine
Hmm.
itself. Now, the next, it seems, having read your second chapter of your book,
Hmm.
it seems that the next most term is tirosh, and this
Mm.
appears quite frequently, and especially, I would say, also for Jewish listeners, it appears in the second paragraph of the Shema. So it's something that's part of our
Mm.
daily liturgy, anyways. We're talking about
Hmm.
we're talking about wine, anyways.
Yeah.
So can you, to be honest, like I wasn't entirely sure reading this.
Yeah.
So can you, I'm going to
Yeah.
give it a, because my sense is it's like the harvest. It's like, but not literally
Yes.
the grapes. But it's some sort of a wine that's derived from the grapes associated with the harvest. Is that a fair
Yeah,
characterization?
yeah, totally. So basically, with tirosh, we have these references that have made scholars wonder if we're actually talking about wine or if maybe we're talking about the raw materials themselves. Like maybe we're talking about grapes. So the best passage here is Isaiah 65, verse 8, I believe, which refers to tirosh being in the cluster of grapes. And so people are like, hey, look, it's not referring to wine, it's referring to grapes. It's not even referring to juice, it's referring to grapes. So we see that, but we also see some people will point out, hey, there are some passages though that seems like you can drink tea roche, which would
Mhm.
imply that it's at least juice or must of some
Mhm.
kind. Um, there's a passage in Micah 6, a few others. But what I would point out is there's even references to intoxication. And that
Mhm.
I would say that really does point in the direction of we're talking about something that is wine. But so then the question is, well, what's the difference with yayin, right? Um, what you kind of get a sense of is people are associating it with harvest. So whether it's juice, so of course you're only going to get juice at harvest time, or the grapes themselves, which you're going to harvest at harvest time naturally.
Yeah.
And so what I think T. Roche ultimately refers to, and I'm definitely drawing upon the work of Carrie Walsh. I think that tirosh is ultimately referring to the the freshly made wine at harvest time. So, in
Mhm.
other words, tirosh specifically refers to freshly made wine,
Mhm.
not wine that hasn't fermented yet. I really don't like the sort of arbitrary and kind of anachronistic distinction between unfermented and fermented wine. I don't
Mhm.
think that's applicable to biblical literature or the ancient world at all.
Mhm.
Really, you have fermenting and fermented is kind of the distinction that I tend to make.
Mhm.
So I think T. Roche then is young, it's fresh, whereas
Mhm.
yayin implies some aging to it. And I
Mhm.
think why that might be important is because of some of the ways in which you might, for example, store your yayin. So yayin, if it's got uh, enough ABV, enough alcohol, you can store it and you can age it.
Mhm.
But when you do that, there's a question. Of course, we're thinking of maybe modern storage practices where, oh, it's going to, benefit from time. And that may have been true in plenty of cases.
Mhm.
But the ways that you would seal the amphorae or the different kinds of vessels to ensure that oxidization would not occur, that it would not turn into vinegar, for example, is
Mhm.
you would need to use like pitch. You would need to use
Mhm.
tree resin to really create tight seals, and you would use vessels that might not impart the best flavors. So when you're talking about yayin versus tirosh, that's why I think a distinction is helpful in biblical literature because with tirosh you're not going to get all of those potential effects that you might not love about wine. The kinds of things like maybe the pitch, the resinous flavors, the
Mhm.
whatever might be imparted from vessels like amphorae, which aren't wooden lovely
Mhm.
oak barrels, for example. Um, Now, I do think their palates would be very different from ours, that they
Hmm.
would have been acclimated to it. They would have appreciated
Hmm.
these sorts of things. I don't think were making stuff they didn't enjoy.
Yeah.
Um, I definitely think we wouldn't like a lot of ancient wine, and
Hmm.
I would assume that they wouldn't like a lot of our wine as well. It just palates would be different.
Hmm.
But that I think ultimately is what tirosh is fresh wine, not fresh in terms of like grape juice. So new wine in the sense of newly made, not in the sense of like we've just pressed it or we've just,
Yeah.
treaded out the juice, for example.
So before, so I'm curious because I know there are other terms that appear. Are there
Mm.
terms that you think would be more applicable to the freshly pressed grape juice?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, there are a few
yeah.
terms.
Okay.
So, in Exodus, I think there's Dema. In number 6, there's Mishra, which seems to refer to juice. But the kind of the term that's used the most, and it's actually only used like 5 times, is ossis.
Mhm.
And that comes from the verb for treading.
Hmm.
So the idea of ossis referring to kind of like fresh must, and I use the term must rather than juice, just to because I think juice. I think we have this kind of static, stable idea because of refrigerators and because of Welch's grape juice, right? We think of
Right, from
juice.
the late 19th century.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
I try to say the term must rather than juice as much as I can, just because I think must preserves the idea that we're talking about something that has this sugary quality to it that
Mhm.
is going to ferment naturally,
Mhm.
as opposed to juice just being this like stable
Wait, can,
thing.
can I just break in? I
Yeah.
was looking at a wine bottle this summer
Hmm.
and it had the word vinification. And I thought to
Mm.
myself, without looking anything up, I'm like, this would only come about after Dr. Welch
Mm.
came up with his invention. And
Mm.
so, wouldn't you know it, the first time vinification ever occurred was like 1880. I'm like, I knew it.
Interesting.
So I mean, it's an English word,
Hmm.
but meaning it never even existed in English before a century and a half ago. And if that's in English, it's true for all these. So I'm just kind of curious, and maybe there could be little, 0 to 3 days, let's say post press
Mm.
versus,
Yeah.
because maybe
Yeah.
there's stuff going on, maybe it's very bubbly,
Yeah.
versus maybe a 3 to 20 day versus a 20 to 50 day sort of situation. I don't know.
Yeah. No, definitely. There could have been people who really enjoyed, the must right after it was pressed. That could
Yeah.
be, I was just at a winery I volunteer at often here in Minnesota, and trying the freshly pressed juice was so delightful. Just like
Huh.
truly delightful. But here's the thing. In the ancient world, you can only enjoy that once a year.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Late harvest, or late,
Mhm.
late summer at harvest time.
Yeah.
So the idea of preserving that in its state of, fresh, lovely sugariness,
Yeah.
that's just not something you're going to be able to preserve
Huh.
long term, especially
Hmm.
not at scale. There
Yeah.
are these references to like, things that you could potentially do to sort of keep it in that state, but
Hmm.
they all require something quite ridiculous, and we don't have archaeological evidence that shows that people, for example, in Israel, since we're interested in biblical studies
Mhm.
here, we don't have any evidence that this was ever practiced in Israel,
Hmm.
and that people knew about it or that they would have cared. That's the other thing is like it's such a modern
Hmm.
anxiety to be like, oh, well, how did they maybe keep it from getting alcoholic? I don't think they cared about that. There's
No.
no evidence that they cared about that. Plus, they didn't understand how fermentation works. It's a miracle. Fermentation is
So,
miraculous. Do you know what I mean?
but they probably had a sense of timeline.
Oh, sure. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
of course, as you are cultivating, as you
Hmm.
are doing this over and over and over again,
Hmm.
yes. But I think there is definitely a sense in which, and I think this is why it's, wine and other alcoholic beverages in the ancient world are so often associated with rituals surrounding, cultic spaces with the divine, is because there's this kind of idea that somehow this stuff is uniquely from the gods, or that the gods were somehow involved in some way. I think that is a broader belief, and so I think that, yeah, they didn't really quite know how it worked. Certainly didn't know what yeast was, right?
Yeah.
Hey there. Hope you've been enjoying this episode so far on biblical beverages. If you like drinking in the Bible, here's a sneak peek into next week's episode on drinking in the book of Daniel.
This seems to be his first act of pushing back. And it's so amusing that the first act of a Jew pushing back has to do with the food and the drink. It's consumption.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode on drinking in the book of Daniel. Now back into this episode on biblical beverages.
So we've talked about yayin. We've talked about tirosh. You mentioned asis, which we're still bracketing shekhar for the time being. So there's yayin, which appears probably over 100 times, right?
Yeah.
Tirosh, which I've never looked into how frequently that appears in the Bible.
Tirosh, I want to say it's like, my instinct is like 30 something times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely a fair amount just in Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
It's probably a really significant amount. And
Yeah. I've often wondered why. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, but I've often wondered, because I do think it's important, like when we're having these these conversations about a topic like, wine in the Bible or something like that, or alcoholic beverages in the Bible, is we tend to paint with a really broad brush and kind of conflate all of these interesting nuances in the various corpora of biblical literature. Like, why is it that Deuteronomy is really into tirosh? I think that's worth, thinking about.
My non-researched but gut reaction to tirosh being so prevalent in the book of Deuteronomy is it's a reward. So, and it's part of that triumvirate, that trio of the yitzhar and the tirosh chavitzar chavidigan. So the wheat, the wheat or the other, grain-based product yield, your oil, which is really just pressed olives, and then you have this, which is pressed grapes. So this trio, which is regularly recurring throughout the book of Deuteronomy, but it's part of this reward structure. And this is, hopefully everything's going to be good. You don't know that it will. You got to play by the rules here, and then you'll get rewarded.
Right.
And I also think, especially with regards specifically to the tirosh, but I imagine it can apply equally to both the grains and the oil, which is you can then do what you'd like with them. Meaning, especially when we're thinking within a drinking context, people like their wine differently. And especially when you're given, it's now been pressed. So you don't have to worry about what the weather's going to be like. Are the grapes going to be good? You've made it through all that. You don't have to worry about the harvesting. You made it through all that. You don't even have to worry about the pressing of the grapes. You just done that. Now it's entirely up to you to age it how you'd like, to handle it, and really to mold it to the taste that you want to get the yield out of this malleable grape product.
Right. No, it's great.
Yeah. So that's great. I mean, I haven't really researched this, but that's my sort of feeling of reading these things.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think there is a kind of agricultural interest, as well as how it relates to, kind of the promise of land and what could come of it. And I think that is certainly a thing. And that's just kind of, highlighting the point of like getting into the specifics of these texts and how they are uniquely developing themes related to alcoholic beverages, and then why they might, for example, be interested in certain terms or certain stages, let's say, in the process.
Yeah. And I would also say that I don't think it's any accident that it's part of that trio. So you've got grains that are really the staple. That's how you get bread. That's the staple of any meal, or a lot of the meals at least. Then you have oil, which really enhances things. And then you've got wine, which brings joy to life. So that's part of the reward.
Yeah.
And that's exciting. That's something that people want to desire. And more importantly, that's certainly anybody reading the book of Deuteronomy, that is a valued product.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. So tirosh is number two, and
Yeah.
still bracketing shekhar. Then you like Assis is you got 5 appearances. Shir, it's in Song of Songs and a couple other places.
Yeah. Well, my favorite references are in Joel and Amos. We have these references to mountains dripping sweet wine, and
Yeah.
and of course it's to this term that it's a question of, okay, are we referring to something that is fermenting? I think the reason why it's often rendered sweet wine, as you'll see in some English translations,
Mhm.
is because of a recognition that it's sugary still. In other words, a lot of
Mm.
the sugars haven't fermented, but in time it will become tirosh, it will become yayin.
Mm.
That's how I see it. So it's not like this is some distinctive thing
Mhm.
from the other terms that we've been talking about. It's more about a timeline, I would say. You've had Dr. Rebecca Welton on a few times. She won't agree with this, but Isaiah 49, 26 could be a passage that suggests that Ossis can also intoxicate.
Mm.
It's debated. Dr. Welton won't agree with me, and that's all right. But could potentially be a passage that reinforces this idea that it can be intoxicating. But
Mm.
what I think is interesting though about the Joel and the Amos passages
Mhm.
there is,
Which you've written about
I
and
yes,
you
I have.
published articles about.
I have, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So, most recently in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament,
Mhm.
JSOT,
Yeah.
I have an article. I basically argue that Joel is an early interpretation of Amos.
Mm.
Don't need to get into specifics there, but what I think is kind of fun is this idea of the mountains dripping sweet wine. Of course, you're going to often imagine that on hills and spaces like that is going to be an ideal place for terracing vines, right?
Mm.
And so the idea of the mountains dripping with sweet wine, it's as if like the treading is just taking place right there, and it's just
Mm.
spilling over and down the mountains, right? So
Huh.
that's where I think the kind of etymology of like assis coming from asas, this verb for treading, just adds a lot to that scene, as we see it in Amos, and in Joel.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode. So there's some other terms that also
Yep.
get, but like very infrequently.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a handful others.
There are, yeah. Well, I mean, so it depends on what you do with like chometz.
Mm.
So like this vinegar sour wine, as it's often translated. I think we have to acknowledge that again, just like we might think of vinegar as this like stable thing that's like in our fridge. Oh, this is vinegar. There's no alcohol in it. I don't think we should assume that vinegar is in the Bible is like purely oxidized and there's no more alcohol. I think we should imagine there are stages of oxidation, right?
Mm.
And that at times we're dealing with something like kombucha, for example, where it's a mix of, acetic acid,
Mhm.
what we would think of as contributing to vinegar, and then still the presence of alcohol.
Mm.
So, for example, why does the Nazir refrain from chometz?
Mm.
Well, because it could have alcohol in it, and the whole point is this person who is undertaking this vow should not consume alcohol.
Mhm.
Why can't they eat grapes? Because they can ferment on the vine, right? So
Mm.
like the whole thing is designed with respect to the potential to consume alcohol.
Hmm.
The vinegar could have the alcohol, the grapes could have the alcohol, and so could, well, obviously, wine and shekhar, whatever shekhar is.
Mhm.
We agree on what shekhar is, but it's debated in scholarship. I think that's what's going on. The Nazarite who is undertaking this vow is abstaining from alcohol in whatever form. That's why all these products are also, prohibited because they could have alcohol in it.
There's also the Aramaic of ḥemer. Doesn't that appear also?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
ḥemer.
there's a couple references. And this seems to just be sort of the Aramaic term for yayin. And the way the Septuagint handles it, for example, it renders it as oinos, just like it does yayin. So it
Mhm.
seems that at least some bit of linguistic evidence suggests that they are kind of interchangeable. So there's a related Hebrew term, ḥemer, which is often translated as like foaming wine or something like this. It appears in Deuteronomy 32, verse 14, and the idea is that this could be fermenting wine that is fermenting. So why is it foaming? Well, it could be in the process of fermentation still.
Mhm.
But another thought, and I kind of go with this idea, is that it could actually be not the foaming of fermentation, but the sort of foaming of carbonation. That it
Mm.
could be, for example, that it's the same process. The carbon dioxide's being released, but the question is, if or the issue is if it's trapped, if it's held in some way, it will, and it doesn't release, it will create carbonation.
Mhm.
And so I think that it's possible that we're dealing with a kind of carbonated red wine. A modern example of this, because some people might be like, wait, I've never heard of that, or I only think of like, champagne or prosecco or some type of sparkling wine like that. If you like Italian wines, you might be familiar, of course, with Lambrusco, which is a kind of sparkling red. I don't think, of course, that that's what we're dealing with in Deuteronomy 32, but I think the reference to this kind of foaming wine, I think we're probably talking about the foam of carbonation rather than fermentation. There's another
Mm.
example. It's not the same term, but there's another passage where I think it could be referring to the same sort of idea, which is Psalm 75, where it talks about this. Foaming yayin, but the question is, are we dealing with, and in context, let me just back up. In context, we're this is a passage that is often clustered in the kind of cup of wrath
Mm.
set of passages. So this
Uh-huh.
is something that ultimately is a symbol of judgment, right?
Mhm.
And so the idea that it's fermenting, if that's the case, then we'd be talking about something that's not as like strong as it could be, that it's
Mm.
still in the process of gaining strength.
Yeah.
So I think the foam there is not the foam of fermentation, which again could imply that it's weaker. I think it's
Mhm.
the foam of carbonation. And
Mm.
so I think both of these passages could be, and it's, of course, it's debated. We can't know for sure, but I think these could be references to carbonated wines.
Mm.
Not exactly what we would think of as sparkling, but this, I think, is probably the closest set of examples that could lead us in that direction.
Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people you know also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
So the term we've been all waiting for, appearing 23 times throughout Tanakh, throughout the Hebrew Bible, is shekhar, which we have dealt with previously here on the show, having had
Yeah.
Professor Homan
Yes.
back in 2020, and then shortly thereafter, Professor Jenny Ebling, and
Yes.
both of whom you cite in your second
Yes.
chapter.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
so they very much clearly see shekhar as beer, but it sounds like you, which just for the listeners, first appears in Leviticus 10, second time in number 6, which you reference with the Nazir
Yeah.
stuff. So Can you share with us some of the I don't know, academic debates around this term? Clearly, they don't see beer as shekhar, or shekhar as beer
Yes.
rather.
Yeah, so there is definitely a debate. So you've mentioned
Mhm.
some great proponents of the view that it refers to beer. Dr. Welton is another proponent
Mm.
of this. Jacob Milgram as well
Ooh,
is a
wow.
proponent.
An
Yeah,
OG.
so
Okay.
an OG
An OG,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, back in the early '90s, in his Anchor Bible commentary was arguing for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say what you really have is a question of, okay, on the one hand, you've got people who want to say it's always paired with yayin or not, it's not actually always, but it's often paired with yayin. And
Yeah.
so maybe it is a generic term that
Mm.
just kind of refers to, um, a fermented beverage of whatever sort,
Yeah.
whatever concoction. And so you kind of have this kind of generic approach to it. But if you don't have a generic approach to it, you typically are going to say there's one of three possible sources of sugar to create this alcohol:
Hmm.
either grape, date, or grain.
Hmm.
And so this is how it shakes out, where you've either got shekhar is basically wine or a type of distilled grape-based spirit like grappa, which is not persuasive at all because
Wait, are there actual scholars who
there
argue
are,
for
yes,
distillation?
yes, and well, they'll argue for some type of like crude, like experimental version of distillation. But yeah, it's a medieval, sort of development,
Okay.
distillation. They definitely weren't doing proper distillation. But
Huh.
you have some people who said it's a kind of grappa. A great example actually is Robert Alter,
Really?
who I really, really, really respect. I just don't think he's right at all about this.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but you have others who say, okay, it's not grape based, presumably, but it is date based. So you've got some type of date wine of some kind, and
Or date beer.
or date beer. But actually, the people who typically say it's date based will like, for example, I'm thinking of Patrick McGovern,
Ooh,
who I
okay.
also really, really respect. If for listeners who don't know, he is the Indiana Jones of alcoholic beverages in the ancient world. He is an archaeologist, a chemist. I mean, read everything written by Patrick McGovern. He's
Hmm.
amazing. He's amazing.
Hmm.
But he argues based on Proverbs 20, verse 1, I think it's verse 1, where it says, yayin is a mocker and
Hmm.
shekhar is a brawler. He argues that
Uh-huh.
there's an intensification there, and
Huh.
so that we should see shekhar as stronger in ABV than yayin typically is. So
Hmm.
that's where the kind of, obviously, if you want to think it's distilled, that's where you could get there. It's a bad argument, I would say.
Okay. I
But
was
if
scratching
you
my head about that.
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah. But if you want to say, well, no, 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 distillation didn't occur, but maybe you get a higher concentration of fermentable sugars from dates, so maybe that's how you get the higher ABV that allows you to sort of make that sort of case. The problem with that, I would say, is, well, again, they don't know how fermentation works, but the yeast is going to do its thing, and then it's going to peter out.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like it doesn't matter if it's grapes or if it's dates, it's gonna stop.
Yeah.
So
It's got a limit. It's got a
yeah, it's
limit.
got a limit.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the yeast will actually, it doesn't matter what the sugar source is, the yeast will stop. So I think that's what some people have said. And then the other position is that it's grain based, that we're talking about beer. Probably the most debated passage here is number 6, the
With
Nazarite
nausea.
vow.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's probably the most debated passage in
Hmm.
all of this. And what some people would say is, hey, look at the references to grapes, look at the references to vinegar, look at,
Hmm.
we're dealing with a grape-based product. We're not dealing with some other product. But what I would say is, you can make, of course, vinegar from beer. If you've ever been to the UK and had fish and chips and poured malt vinegar on your fish or your chips, you
Mhm.
know full well that you can
Mhm.
make vinegar from beer. Um, but also, I think, the reason why grain isn't mentioned in that passage is because grain isn't susceptible to fermentation in exactly the same way that a grape could be, right?
Mhm.
Where a grape is going to could ferment on the vine, for example.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so
You're
I
not
think,
you're not worried about wheat or barley
yeah,
fermenting.
exactly. In the same way.
Right,
Exactly. You're
right.
not worried about it in the same way. So I think that's why, I think that's one reason why it's not mentioned
Mhm.
there. The Numbers 28
Mhm.
reference that you just sort of
Yeah, for
mentioned there,
the daily
the
libation.
daily libation. So let's think about that. If it's the case that harvest is once a year, and of course for grapes, and you are making your wine, of course you're gonna store it and save it and all these sorts of things. But beer can be made anytime, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
You don't have to wait for a specific sort of time of year or whatever. You can just make your beer. So I think that a daily offering from something that's grain based makes a lot more sense than something that's grape based,
Mhm.
and so that's a bit of biblical evidence that I think points in this direction, that it's the kind of thing that you could make more regularly and
Mhm.
then be able to have it to make those libations.
And it's it's really fascinating about the ambiguity around it because I mean, I think that's what really motivates all this conversation or really generates a lot of this because it never states what it's made out of, whether
Yes,
it's the
right.
dates.
Yes.
And I will say this, one of the great things that Holman says is when the book of Deuteronomy talks about the seven species of the land, there's barley, there's wheat. I mean, you also
Yeah.
have dates there. Like
Yeah.
these are mentioned very specifically in the book of Deuteronomy. It's not like grains are unknown
Yeah.
or somehow not associated with the land. It's very
Yeah.
clearly there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the other thing that Homan talked about was literally every other land around Israel had beer. If they did
Yes.
not have beer, that would
Yes.
be really weird.
It would be really weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it would also be weird to think that they didn't have a term for it, right?
Yes.
That they
Yeah.
have no way of referring to it.
Mhm.
Not to mention because the Akkadian term that shekhar comes from does
Yeah.
refer to beer. So
Yeah.
it just seems like, okay, come on, guys.
Right.
But I think there are actually some really good you know reasons for explaining why scholarship has been so hesitant. And this is something that like Jenny Ebling and Rebecca Welton
Mhm.
will point out, for example, is that there's a kind of, interest in vineyards and wine because it, takes more effort and presumably was overseen by men and all these things. Whereas
Mhm.
beer is a
Mhm.
domestic beverage, usually made by women,
Mhm.
who are baking the bread, for example, who are in charge of that type of domestic activity. I mean, this is why all these goddesses in Mesopotamia, for example, are associated with beer, like Ninkasi or whatever. So, or like Siduri, and so it just all of this kind of points in this, direction that there is a kind of bias against
Mm.
it. And I think it's not just the kind of gender dynamic, but it's also think about like refined culture, right? Like wine is sophisticated, right?
Yeah.
Beer is for, the pub crawlers who are spilling over themselves, right? But
Right.
wine is culture, and I feel like that is the horse that's pulling the cart in a lot of
Mm.
respects,
Yeah.
with this. And I even see some Christian nervousness around how to translate shekhar, for example.
Huh.
So in the NIV, the updated NIV, it regularly will render it as beer, which is great, right?
Yeah.
I agree with this. But
Yeah.
then there are a handful of places where it refuses to translate it as beer, and the only good explanation is nervousness.
Uh-huh.
And a great example is like Numbers 28, where it's like, wait, you're translating shekhar as beer everywhere else. Why aren't you doing it here?
Huh. Yeah.
There seems to be something going on. you
I
know.
have not done a serious study of going through different translations, but the ones that I have come across, you don't have to go through all 23 appearances to see that in the same exact translation, they use different words for this one word. Whether
Mm.
it's a strong drink is pretty
Yeah.
common,
Yes.
which I'm
Yes.
like, what is a strong drink? Or like, is this a
Exactly.
liqueur? Like,
Exactly.
or I don't know. They get really weird about it.
Right. And I think strong drink is particularly rough because if we're talking about ancient beer, we are actually referring to something that's probably on average 3 to 5% at most.
Right.
At most. So
Right.
strong drink, I think, is really misleading. But of course,
Yeah.
the reason why is because of the root, right? In Hebrew, right? We're talking
Mm.
about something that can
Oh,
intoxicate.
yeah.
But I would say we do have to think about associations here,
Mm.
right? Like going back to this kind of cultural sophistication of like wine versus beer. When you think of beer and culturally, there's such an association with like getting drunk at a bar or something like that,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
As opposed to wine. Like wine, you're being elegant, you're having a lovely
Right.
meal, right?
Right.
But beer, you're getting drunk. But of course, what's so silly about that, and this is true today, what's so silly about that is
Yeah.
beer is weaker in ABV than wine, right?
Yeah.
The issue, the reason why we have these associations is because of habits around alcohol consumption.
Mm.
Not the thing itself, not because it actually is stronger, but
Uh-huh.
because of what we do with beer. And I don't
Yeah.
mean like all of us. I mean, in order for this sort of reputation to
Yeah.
persist, you have some type of you know template in your mind of like college students pounding beer, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
And I think that is that's the kind of thing that where I think could explain the association with drunkenness in particular.
Mm.
That it's just something that you could just drink all the time. Um,
Mm.
whereas wine, especially in the Bible, there's a stronger association with particular events, particular days,
Mm.
particular rituals, and
Mm.
I think that might have something to do with the sort of distinction.
Cool. I will ask, are there any other reasons to not translate shekhar as beer and that people are trying to push it into the wine category? Is it largely because of the number 6 or numbers 28 or
I I would say um, there's one other passage that probably does have some force here, which is Deuteronomy 14. Is it
that's the
verse 20?
second? Is that the tithe up to Jerusalem?
Yeah, and it's where you can drink your yayin or your shekhar.
Yeah, with like
As it
meat in Jerusalem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And I think what makes people nervous about that is, well, A, they don't like well, you think about like how it's typically translated as strong drink. The idea of it being permissible here in general, drinking strong drink for some conservative religious people might be like pretty wild. Like, wait,
yeah.
you're doing what exactly?
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't really help us with this question of beer. But I do think that a modern English translation in which beer has the reputation that it does, saying that you can drink, wine or beer, right, in the
Yeah.
presence of the Lord, is okay, right? And
Yeah.
actually, that this is something you're supposed to do. Like, I think that probably makes some people nervous. But again, no matter how you translate it, we're clearly dealing with something that's intoxicating. So
Yeah.
you get some goofy ways around that where some people will
Hmm.
say, oh no, this is something that you're going to libate or tithe, not something that you're going to actually consume. And I think it's pretty obvious that it's being consumed.
Professor Dunn, thank you so much so far for this really fascinating, insightful conversation. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
As you mentioned, I'm one of the hosts and editor of the Two Cities podcast. And sometime next year, hopefully, like in the run up to my book being released, we're going to do a series of episodes on alcohol in
Hmm.
biblical literature and then thinking about more contemporary issues. And so that's something for listeners to look out for. It's also something that I would like to invite you to be a part of for an episode if you're open to
Sure.
that.
Sure. I thought you meant the listeners generally, but me particularly, sure.
Well, I both the listeners to
Yeah.
check out and for you, Rabbi Drew,
Yeah.
to be a part of, because I mean the work you do here is just brilliant. I wish I had known about your podcast when you started. I was so grateful to actually Rebecca Welton for mentioning that that there's this great podcast that I need to check
That's
out
great.
if I haven't yet, and I was so thrilled. So
Great.
keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that so much. Well, on that note, it's hard to follow that. All right. Well, on that note, l'chaim. Thank you.
L'chaim.